Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Calm COVID conversation with Business Depot. Who would have thought we would still be talking about COVID so long into the piece? But I think the really good thing about this discussion is we're starting to look at long-term preventative handling COVID on a daily basis, which I think is really good. But in saying that, there's a lot of business owners out there who are really struggling to navigate this crazy time of what are the rules, what have we got to do, what are we allowed to do? And so I have the perfect guests for this conversation in relation to vaccinations. I have Justine Ansell, who is an IR lawyer and will navigate the employment law side of it for us. And Justine's also a director of IR Legal Solutions. And I've got Jo Kitney, who is a workplace health and safety expert and director of Kitney OHS. So Jo's going to come at it from a workplace health and safety perspective. So I've basically got the best people in the room for this. I'm hoping you'll answer all my questions as well today. So how we're going to start this off is it's going to be very Q&A based, definitely. And I've got a list of questions that I'm hoping will cover off most of what the questions are out there. But I do have, please, if you've got a question, use the Q&A button below, and I'm going to keep an eye on those throughout the session. Look, there's a lot to unravel here. So we're going to see what we get through in the next 45 to 50 minutes. And we probably do anticipate we might need another one of these in the new year, but we're going to see how we go. And we also hope that you take away a lot of practical sort of tips to go and sort of sort out things in your business at the back end of this. And we hope to be able to give you some tips via an additional email too. So there'll be a lot of information coming through. So get your notepads ready. We're going to get started. The first place I'd like to start is very relevant, as in Friday, when there was a recent decision made by the Fair Work Commission in relation to BHP's mandatory requirement that employees be vaccinated at their work sites. Now, when I had a look at this, what I could gather from this information was that BHP may not have quite got the consultation with employees right. And although Fair Work seemed to be all for vaccination, mandatory vaccination, I felt like the way they went about it might not have really hit the mark. Justine, do you want to start by adding your two bits in here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hot off the press from Friday, the full bench of the Fair Work Commission making what has been probably the most important decision in terms of employers that aren't governed by the specific laws or government directives around mandating vaccinations or requiring employees to be vaccinated in order to go on site. So basically, in a short summary, the issue in this case was the consultation obligations under the work health and safety legislation. And there's a myriad of consultation obligations that an employer will have when they're effecting a change in the business, including in terms of introducing vaccination off their own bat rather than a government directive. And what the full bench of the Fair Work Commission has said is that had the employer, BHP, consulted or complied with its consultation obligations under the work health and safety legislation, then they would have been satisfied that the requirements that they had to mandate the vaccine, if they'd had meaningful consultation, would have been a strong case in favour of that vaccine mandate being reasonable. So a good decision for employers in terms of guidance on the reasonableness of directing employees to be vaccinated in the absence of a specific law. But it really reiterates the necessity to move in very early in the piece and consult with the employees. So it's not sufficient to make the decision to vaccinate and then go and have a conversation with your employees and consult with them about it. It's interesting because we've got, as I said earlier, a myriad of consultation obligations that employers have. And modern awards and enterprise agreements have consultation provisions, but probably a little bit confusing for employers to navigate. The test comes in after. So it's after you've made a definite decision, you then need to consult about the impacts of that decision on employees, for example, if they're going to lose their jobs or something like that. So the work health and safety legislation is certainly imposing that consultation piece much earlier than businesses are probably used to in the industrial regime of modern awards and an enterprise agreement. So it's important for employers to take heed that it could well be reasonable and a lawful. It was accepted that a direction to mandate a vaccine would be lawful. So there's nothing unlawful about requiring an employer to be vaccinated. So it is a good decision in that sense, but it does mean there's quite a process employers need to go through before looking to mandate off their own bat.
Jo?
Justine, you raised such a valid point there about consultation, and there's the health and safety regime, and then you've got your IR regime, and the structures for consultation are already well prescribed and laid down within legislation, so the Health and Safety at Work Act, but also in the Code of Practice, which is in all harmonised states and territories. So simply by being across those types of documents, it puts the structures that a business can therefore follow, and it provides the guidance on how that might be conducted. So whether that's formally through the Health and Safety Committee or Health and Safety reps, or through other means that you have within the business, it's absolutely critical to engage with employees and other types of workers in the risk assessment phase.
And so business owners and employers, they can't skip this step. The consultation on these big decisions is so important, isn't it?
It is, and I think where BHP were headed were essentially at the end of the road, and I'm sure we'll touch on this later in the webinar about, well, what do you do once you've mandated the vaccine for employees and then you have employees refusing? And so if you're getting to a point of a termination, the issue is you're usually providing a decision to or proposing to terminate an employee's employment on the basis they haven't followed a reasonable and lawful direction. And in this case, that direction isn't a lawful and reasonable direction. So it can really undermine the process you follow after you've implemented a mandate like this if you failed to capture the obligations in the work health and safety legislation. And Jo can probably speak better than I, but there are implications for not complying with the obligations under the work health and safety legislation, which can include prosecution, it can include fines as well. So it can really unravel the process that you've put in place to manage this risk on site if you don't follow the consultation early enough and make sure that it's real and it's genuine. It's not just a step in the process that's not really factored in to genuinely listen to the employees, the Work Health and Safety Committee, and actually consults properly.
Yeah. So let's say I'm a business, I want to understand whether I can mandate vaccinations in the workplace or whether I even need to. I would say, this is sort of a question to you, Jo, initially, is that a risk assessment is the way to go to start with this, isn't it? It's a way to go about figuring out where we go with this sort of topic. Can you sort of elaborate on that for us?
Absolutely. Certainly the structures for undertaking a risk assessment, again, are already laid down within health and safety. And so it is following the basic structures that are in place. If we look at it within the context, though, of COVID vaccinations, the first and foremost thing is to understand the context of the business. So putting some structures around how you go about doing a risk assessment or even deciding if you need to do one. So what type of business are you? Who are your employees? Where are they working? The government mandates, the health and safety guidance or legislation that is there. What does that actually mean in the context of your organisation? That's the first and foremost. Now, if there are already mandates in place and you have to vaccinate, so if we look at aged care or childcare, it may be that you actually don't need to do a risk assessment. It is simply about contextualising it, putting in place the arrangements through consultation and managing the arrangements in regards to workers and their views, and what do you do with those that choose not to be vaccinated. The decision to do a risk assessment is where it's a little more grey. And so it's a business that doesn't necessarily have any mandates associated with it, but you want to make a decision. So that's where you would follow the general basic steps within risk assessment. So that's identifying who might be harmed and how. The posture or the risk tolerance of the organisation will come into play here. So we know that if somebody catches COVID, there is the potential for them to end up in hospital and it be fatal. So there's a very scalable approach to how somebody may be affected by COVID, and that has to be factored into the position or the posture of the organisation from a risk perspective. So once you've done your basic risk assessment, so that's looking at the government requirements, your workforce, you look at it through the lens of, what work do people actually do, where will they be? You'll probably find that you can break your staff down. So that's categories of staff. So there may be some that need to be vaccinated because they're going to customer sites where there's a mandatory requirement. You may have some that can't be vaccinated for medical reasons. So how do you manage that? Is working from home an option? So you'll find that you'll have different categories of staff in there. Speaking to staff or getting their feedback through that process is really critical, because at the end of the day, it is actually about them. Once you've done your risk assessment and you've identified what your reasonable control measures are, the hierarchy of control exists already within the principles of health and safety. So if we're looking at saying we can't eliminate work, or we can't eliminate COVID from the workplace, vaccinations stand as a higher order control over behaviour or instruction, and that would be your social distancing or hygiene measures. So there is a very good reason for considering vaccination as a mandatory requirement within a business, but it is up to the business to make that decision. Once you've made your decision, again, consultation and just informing the workforce as well as those that may come in contact with your workforce. So that may be delivery drivers or visitors that you have. So if you're making a decision to have a COVID vaccinated workforce, then there will be potentially other implications to consider there. I would look at it, though, through the lens not just of health and safety. That's where you would look to speak to someone like Justine from a legal perspective. So what are the IR implications? What are the business implications? So it is a multidisciplinary approach. I think one of the challenges, just to round out on risk assessment for COVID, is that health and safety sets us up to do risk assessments for, things like confined space and electrical safety and manual handling. This is very much about the health in health and safety. So it's about the people. So therefore we have to recognise that even health and safety people, this may be new to them. So it is also about getting good guidance if you haven't got that skill set within the business.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add there, Justine?
Look, I think the full bench of the Fair Work Commission certainly accepted that vaccination is the most effective and efficient control measure available to combat the risks of COVID. So they are recognising that vaccines are a really important part of managing the work health and safety on site. But they also accepted as being uncontentious that an unvaccinated person is more likely to acquire COVID from another unvaccinated person rather than a vaccinated person. So it just presents all of that risk in the business that you really do need to be understanding in detail. It's certainly not going to be the case that you have one size fits all for your business, and then even one size fits all in terms of if you were to move to a mandate off your own bat rather than a government directive. You could have, as Jo's touched on, a variety of different workers, a range of different factors and risks that will indicate where it might be reasonable for a direction for some employees that are in a high risk group or they're interacting with vulnerable workers versus an employee that is very much isolated and able to control their environment by working from home. I know, Anna, you mentioned that we will send through some links after the end of the presentation, and one good one to reference is the Fair Work Ombudsman's website. They've developed essentially a 4-tiered structure that will help you to look at your business on a case-by-case basis to determine where you might fit into and whether a vaccine mandate would be reasonable. And obviously the higher the risk of exposure, the more likelihood that that direction is going to be reasonable. So it's certainly a situation that's presented to businesses with no just simple yes or no answer on this. It's really quite complex. You've got to go in and really look at and understand your business and the risk.
Absolutely. And sorry, just picking up there about information, there is sufficient information readily available in the public domain to be able to, for any business to be able to manage this situation. So one of the links
goes through a sort of a bit of a step-by-step process, right?
Yeah, most definitely. And if you follow a sort of a structured approach, you just make sure you've got the right information coming in at the right time to make the right decision. And so Safe Work Australia have actually introduced on their website, you can actually look at vaccination, but choose the industry type, and it will tell you the guidance from a health and safety perspective. And you can then couple that with your state or territory regulator guidance. So the information's definitely there. It's just a case of teasing your way through it because it's fairly lengthy.
Yeah, you do just have to make the time to go through it, unfortunately.
You do.
My next question was kind of around that government mandate, and really where I was coming from, and feel free to take this in a different direction, was that there are some government mandates out there for sure, and that's going to make it really easy for some industries. So the restaurant industry, for argument's sake, we know in Queensland, come Friday the 17th, if you're not vaccinated, you're not going into a restaurant. But what about those employers, I suppose, that it's not so straightforward for? And we've already talked about a few things to think about, but is there anything to add in relation to, I suppose, deciding, when you do your risk assessment, deciding to mandate vaccinations? So we obviously have done our consultation, we've done our risk assessment, we know we want to mandate the vaccinations in our business. So what else has to be considered when we do that?
A really important aspect, I would say, is mental health, and particularly the considerations for those who may be interfacing with the public who may not necessarily agree with the vaccine mandates that are being established by a business. So whether it's a mandated requirement in a restaurant or other, or a business that simply chooses to go down that route, it's a very contentious issue for some people, and they make their voices well known and can be quite confrontational at times. They're in a minority, but if they are likely to impact your business, then it's worthwhile considering what will you do if your staff need to enforce the mandated rule, and how are you going to protect and consider your workers in those circumstances.
And I was just going to add, I think one of the main thing businesses need to get a handle on is knowing and understanding whether one of those government mandates do apply to them. There are penalties, and in some states, including Queensland and New South Wales, there's actually up to 6 months imprisonment if you don't comply. So it's really important for businesses to know for which of their employees these specific laws apply, and make sure that they follow the requirements in that, in terms of obtaining the vaccine information in the required form. And there is a link on the Fair Work Ombudsman's website that has all of the specific mandates listed, because they're changing regularly, and they're different in every state. And we've seen about an hour ago the Queensland government release the one you've just referenced, Anna, in terms of hospitality and the public health mandate there. So, there's really those two buckets in terms of understanding for which employees you're going to have to comply with the government mandate. And if you have employees that sit outside of that for some reason, whether if there's an employment contract or an enterprise agreement that already requires vaccination, that might be enough to mandate, or moving to, is it going to be a reasonable and lawful direction? And we already know that there's quite a process that you need to follow in order to be able to implement that in the business without it being unpicked later, particularly if you do have that minority that have chosen not to get vaccinated, which of course is a personal choice. At the end of the day, there needs to be a process for a business to be able to manage that. And you want assurance that if you do end up in somewhere like the Fair Work Commission on an unfair dismissal claim, for example, and we have seen a number of those claims coming through the Commission now, if you've got a terminated employee because they're remaining unvaccinated and you need them either by virtue of the mandate or reasonable and lawful direction to be vaccinated. So,
yeah, it can get complicated for sure. I've got a question here just on mandating vaccinations from the audience, and that is the risk to the business in relation to medical reactions to vaccinations. Are either of you able to talk to that?
So just it's a really valid question, and certainly one that I hadn't planned for, but I will still give an answer to it. So it's a question without notice, but it's always the best. Look, at the end of the day, people receive their vaccinations under medical advice. They're administered through their GP or through a clinic, and the conversation is between the person and their medical provider. And they go through a series of checks and balances to the suitability of somebody to have that vaccination. I haven't yet had a conversation around, well, what if they had an issue and the only reason that they had that vaccine was because they needed it for work reasons. So I don't particularly have an answer to it, other than the fact that it is an employee choice. And so it would be up between them and their doctor to have that conversation. If they had concerns, then it comes back to the workplace to try and deal with it or address it. But a vaccine should only ever be given under medical advice anyway. But it is a relatively new vaccine. But however, millions of people have been vaccinated, and we will know longitudinally what the longer term implications are of that, if any, going forward.
There's also, just to tie off that with Jo, there is a no-fault indemnity scheme. So if you do have a significant or adverse reaction to the vaccine, there is a no-fault scheme in place that does provide compensation. So it's not something that would go ordinarily through, say, for example, workers' compensation claim if it was mandated and the employee became ill because of it. So this separate scheme has been set up. We can set up a link at the end so businesses can have a look at it. It's capped at, I think it's got some caps in it. So it will cover cost of injuries above $5,000. So it would have to be a significant adverse impact. If an employee became ill because of the vaccine, then that might perhaps warrant an employee taking a period of paid personal carers leave off to recover if they've had fairly mild side effects. So definitely some implications for employers if they're encouraging or mandating vaccinations in the workplace with employees.
So here's an interesting one for you. Sorry, go on, Jo.
It's a really interesting position, because for those employers that choose not to mandate the vaccines, or they don't have those policies in place, or workers that may contract COVID, and if they then are hospitalised, it is then a notifiable incident. So it really comes down to the balance of risk assessment. Is it mandated risk assessment, and then each worker looking at it on a really individual perspective for themselves?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be important to understand if you've got vulnerable workers within your business, because that might be one of the factors you look at in determining whether, without a government mandate, you do need to look at mandating the vaccine off your own bat as a lawful and reasonable direction. So you'd really want to have a proper handle on, if there's that additional risk within the business, and then obviously whoever they're interacting with on a daily basis as well. But if there's that causal connection between contracting COVID at the workplace, then that's definitely a risk to a work health and safety, workers' compensation claim.
Yeah, I think also it's recognising that vaccine is not its only control measure. So we still need to maintain, hygiene, and whilst, yes, some of the social distancing may get breached at times, it is ultimately a really important control measure to have some social distancing and cleaning and hygiene for individuals in the workplace. So
and I think employers need to remember that all of that needs to stay in place.
Correct.
Just another step.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. There's a question here. What risk to the employer and the business if the employer decides to refuse to be vaccinated?
Can you just repeat that again, Anna?
So the employer decides not to be vaccinated. So what risks do we have there?
So this is where the employer chooses not to be vaccinated and makes their vaccination status known to their workforce.
Well, you would assume so.
Yeah, okay. Justine, do you want to lead with that one?
Look, I mean, we've seen that case down the Gold Coast where I think there was a young pizza worker who got terminated because she got vaccinated. So I think businesses, you can have your personal choice, and I think the way the government has introduced these specific laws still allow an employee to make the decision as to whether they want to get vaccinated or not. I think if you're the employer yourself and you're making that decision not to be vaccinated, you still need to be making or taking all reasonable steps to manage the risk in the workplace. And one of those risks might actually be you as an unvaccinated worker potentially. So, whether it's the employee or the employer or business owner, those risks still need to be properly managed within the business. And look, it's an interesting question in terms of, is there an obligation to then disclose that to the employees to manage the risk? I think that a level of consultation is definitely what we're seeing. The likes of the Fair Work Commission, the Fair Work Ombudsman are really driving in terms of collectively working through these issues with your employees and having sensible, adult discussions around it to make sure you get as much protection as you can for your employees and for your business, and particularly if they're dealing with stakeholders or third parties that are unvaccinated.
And so, Joe, if you chime in here on workplace health and safety, I mean, the employer who decides not to get vaccinated, there's a risk assessment here around that. There's risks, isn't there, everywhere here?
Yeah, so the employer, under legislation, obviously, the employer would be considered the director or the officer of the organisation. So they have responsibilities to put in place to meet their personal obligations to ensure that the business, the PCBU, meets its obligations, which is to safeguard the workers, understand the hazards and the risks. And Justine makes a really valid point that the employer therefore could present risk. In terms of presenting risk, there would be the objectiveness around whether or not they're vaccinated and the risks associated with that. There's also the safety leadership element that comes in as an employer and leading by example. Now, that's not to say every employer, therefore, should feel obligated to be vaccinated. However, their personal views should not be confused with the management of workplace health and safety. So they still have a responsibility to fulfill their due diligence and ensure that the business meets its obligations.
Joe, if we've got a hybrid environment where we've got some vaccinated, some non-vaccinated employees, we've mentioned a few things along the way about how to manage some of these things. Working from home is one of those factors, which might not be possible for every employer or employee. But what are the other obvious things from that hybrid environment that we should be considering?
Yeah, very valid point. So if an organisation is undertaking a risk assessment, the answers rest in the risk assessment because it's looked at the context of the organisation, the proximity of staff, the location that they're working. Are they outdoors? Are they indoors? The type of work, is it project work where they're grouped together or are they more dispersed within the workplace? Are they moving around? So there's so many different scenarios that can be presented in the workplace. But it's really important to recognise that the basic fundamentals around managing COVID still rests with those core hygiene controls. So there may be government guidelines or regulations, but sufficient spacing between people, and if necessary, putting in place perspex or other types of controls to safeguard individuals in their work areas, ensuring good hygiene, if necessary, working masks. So if they can't be adequately protected and if they're in close proximity, mask wearing may be appropriate. And I guess the timing of work. So if you've got the opportunity to, with hybrid working, at least have a split between numbers within the workplace versus those that are working from home. So all of the control measures that we've been using over the last year or so and have absolutely been refined should still be continued going forward because they also provide, because we need to bear in mind that somebody who's vaccinated and even with a booster can still catch COVID or still and still potentially be contagious. So we have to have these other control measures in place.
And we still don't know enough about it to not have these other control measures.
Absolutely. It is an integrated approach to managing a health risk. And we have to still consider that as part of our go forward for working with COVID.
Yeah. Justine, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, as Joe says, vaccination is just one measure. So, having all of those other ones in place are going to be critical. The Fair Work Ombudsman has posed a whole raft of different questions that they're obviously getting from employers in terms of vaccination issues. And one of them is, can an employee refuse to attend the workplace because they've got a co-worker that's unvaccinated? And essentially they're saying, look, that wouldn't necessarily be reasonable to refuse to then come to work because you have to interact with unvaccinated workers. But all of this is, again, going to come down to what's lawful and reasonable in the business. And I guess the first question, that you're looking at with an unvaccinated worker is why? Is it because they have a medical exemption that needs to be considered? And I know in my practice, we've had a lot of employers having employees that have concerns with getting the vaccine. So they're pregnant or they've got some other medical issue, had an adverse reaction to the flu, etc., that has caused them concern and held them off getting the vaccine. So probably understanding the basis or the reason why an employee is unvaccinated is going to be a really important one. And if they've got a medical exemption, that you get that in the proper form even if you got a medical exemption, and Joe, I'm not sure what your views are on this, but that would indicate you've got an employee with some sort of underlying medical issue. And so there's probably another risk assessment or medical clearance process there to ensure that that employee unvaccinated because of that medical exemption can still come into the workplace and work safely. And we've seen the guidelines that have come out on when you can get a medical exemption are extremely limited. It doesn't include pregnancy. It really only includes a fairly limited number of high-level medical conditions, that are generally temporary, or if you're recovering from COVID itself. So you'd really want to be understanding the basis on which someone is unvaccinated before you then, start on a process down a disciplinary path or a termination path or excluding them from your business.
It's a really interesting question around the remaining portion of the society that still are not yet vaccinated. And if we look at the increasing rates of take-up of vaccines, there is a progressive move up to that 90% and beyond.
Yeah.
I think if we look then at picking up on your point there, Justine, there will be some individuals who are just waiting for that nudge before they get vaccinated. And so that's, government mandates and business decisions will encourage somebody to go down there. You're correct, there's just a very small allowances in terms of medical exemptions. And I, as an employer, would be certainly looking out for medical exemptions that came in from particular surgeries that maybe were questionable decisions. So I think it is reasonable to be able to be observant of when exemptions are coming in. Most definitely, if you've got individuals putting exemptions in, there may be an underlying condition that may otherwise not have become apparent in a workplace. So another key consideration there is confidentiality for the worker and dealing really sensitively around any medical or other issues that are there. And again, getting occupational health or IR or HR advice on how to navigate through that would be an important lens to be put on any decisions that are getting made within the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd be wanting, sorry, Anna, I was going to say you'd be wanting to follow a proper process through not just the introduction of a mandate, but the consequences of any employees that are unable or won't comply with the mandate as well.
So I think that brings us to a really good question, and there's a couple of people have asked this as well as I've got it on my list, is how do we ask about that vaccination status? And I'd assume it's coming from that consultation stage too. How do we go about it? How many questions can we ask? Can we ask it outright? Is it anonymous? What can we do here?
So I'm happy to jump in, Joe, and just start on this one. So essentially, if it's a requirement of a specific law, so one of those government mandates, it may well be compulsory for you to obtain that vaccination information by law and retain a copy of it. So you need to have a look at the mandate if it applies to you. What are the requirements there in terms of holding that information or obtaining it or just viewing it prior to access? So you need to properly understand that. If it's related to a reasonable and lawful direction, then you would think that in order to implement that mandate, you need to know whether the employee is vaccinated or not. Hopefully, most businesses are already in a position where they've been engaging with their employees on this issue and have a general idea of who's vaccinated and who's not. They may well have done a survey in the business to get a sense of that rate. But the privacy principles are really important. This is sensitive health information that a business is collecting. So it's reasonable to collect it if it's a reasonable lawful mandate to vaccinate. And then you would really want to make sure you've held that information in the appropriate manner. No different to probably your other personnel or HR records. So it's securely stored. People don't just have access to it unless they need to administer that vaccine policy. And you've got some really strict parameters around it. Even, for example, when and I think that's that confidentiality issue comes in. Even if you've got a positive case in the business, you shouldn't be identifying those individuals, sort of de-identifying them. So you'd really want to be having a good look at the privacy obligations. Again, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner has some really good guidance and, again, freely available information for employers around those questions of when they can ask for it, and then what they do with it. Where do they put it? What do they need it for? So you've got to be really clear with the employee when you're asking for that information, for what purpose you're requiring it. And again, all coming back to that reasonableness in terms of that request.
And so that's where I'll get you to chime on this too, Jo, but that's where we've got to be careful the types of questions we're asking, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where consultation comes back in.
Yep.
So if you've got a good, open, transparent conversation between the business and its staff, you'll have a viewpoint and a lens on their comfort zone in terms of releasing that information and how it will be held. The other important thing is also what you intend to do with that information. So picking up on Justine's point there, if you're providing services to employers that vaccines are mandated and evidence may be needed for your staff to be able to attend site, the question would be whether or not it's your business that makes that information available with permission and appropriate recognition of any confidentiality. But secondly, whether the staff member may need to prove it when they go to the customer site. So we really have to look beyond the workplace into the workplaces where the staff members may undertake work.
That's a really good point, Jo. I've certainly had clients who have had to mandate because their clients have mandated the vaccine. So, yeah.
Correct. And look, if they're going into a venue, say you've got a Christmas, there's a few people in Brisbane that have told me that they actually had their Christmas parties brought forward from the 17th so that staff members that were not vaccinated were able to attend. After the 17th, you'd have to show that you're vaccinated in order to go into venues. So the reality is we're going to have to get used to showing our vaccination status anyway. The difference is that it's in the context of the workplace that we're looking at here. Yeah,
exactly.
I think one of the concerns I've seen quite often is the employee feels quite exposed to having to provide their medical records to an employer, and then what information are they going to get. So it's really important to understand that it's just the vaccination certificate in the required form. It's not all of your medical records from the day you were born that need to be provided to substantiate it. Each state might have different variances in terms of what the medical exemption needs to look like. In Victoria, for example, it can be a letter from the doctor. So it doesn't need to be other health or medical records of an employee that need to be produced to the employer. So there is, some sense of, limiting the information that does need to go to the employer, but it just needs to be in the required form. And all the business is really needing to do is verify that they're vaccinated, not their whole medical history behind it.
Yeah. So if you can keep it simple and to the point, that's going to be a better way to go than starting to ask too many questions. Policies and procedures. So do we need additional policies in place for this sort of thing? Can it be part of our workplace health and safety system? Jo, maybe starting with you, what's your view on not overcook? We don't have to overcook this, right?
Correct. And there will be some organisations that may only have a single policy from a health and safety perspective and will not necessarily want to have a COVID policy because it will fall under their work health and safety policy. So the context of the organisation will determine both whether or not a policy may need to be established and how it will be approved and then how it will be communicated and the supporting procedures. What a policy or a procedure does is it provides a position and it makes it very clear for workers and staff members to understand, what the position of the organisation is, what the expectations are and the processes for it. So if not putting in place a policy, then certainly having that clarity of communication and information will be really important. So it comes down to the way in which the business wants to present that information back and the formality that it may be provided under. The most important thing is making sure that it's consulted with, that the health and safety reps are included if there's any formal documentation. Does it sit as a health and safety policy or a HR policy? It sits as a business policy that will probably be consulted within those departments for a larger organisation anyway. So it has to be a multidisciplinary approach to the formation and approval of it.
Justine, anything to add there?
Oh, I was just going to say, so I mean, the ones that I've seen from clients are they've either putting it in their work health and safety suite of policies, or they might already have something like an infectious disease policy in place. We certainly see that for bigger businesses where employees are working fairly close together from the flu each year and those sorts of things. But yeah, the consultation is key. And I think, you'd be wanting to look at it from, well, what are the other measures? So remembering that vaccines are just one measure that an employer is taking to manage the risk. So it might be, if you need to document it, you're including those other hygiene measures and other steps businesses are taking. We're getting lots of questions around, look, should we be putting a clause in our employment contracts that requires vaccinations, or a clause in, I've got clients that are renewing enterprise agreements and now considering, well, do we put it in those documents, because then it's a contractual obligation. So it's a much clearer path to requiring that because it's sitting in one of those key documents. And the answer is yes, you can include it in those. Can you just go and change an employee's contract now that's already in place? Well, no, you really need to get their consent to go and include it as a clause in their contract. But it might be something that employers will need to start looking at going forward for prospective employees in terms of looking at mandating, vaccinations, booster shots as well. So again, being too prescriptive, because this is such a rapidly changing environment, could mean you've got to constantly rewrite your policy. So you'd want to take some care in terms of how you're crafting it, and you might take a bit of a broader pitch around, vaccines, booster shots, or other infectious diseases that might come our way.
It's a really valid point about the contract there. So if there is a clause within a contract to say that they will adhere to and comply with the policies and the procedures and the reasonable directions of the organisation, whilst you might put the clarity up there, the reality is it is easier to have a more adjustable approach by including it within your health and safety or other systems. And it is such a moving feat. So it's probably wanting to keep the conversation going with staff and adjust where needed.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, that's right. And we're really still in the early days, aren't we, of managing the mandated vaccines. And, we really haven't seen much in the way of how for example, the Fair Work Commission will deal with a termination for an employee refusing to get vaccinated. We've seen the flu vaccine decision come through a few months ago in terms of an aged care worker that was terminated for refusing to get the flu vaccine, and that was found to not be an unfair dismissal. But, we're still in very early days in terms of how this is all going to play out. So it is constantly changing in terms of what's happening. And what we are seeing is the government increasing the number of employees or people in the community that need to get vaccinated. So, in Brisbane or in Queensland from the 17th, to have a social life here, you need to be vaccinated to go to restaurants and cafes and the like. So I think we'll continue to see an increase of those types of mandates. It's a changing environment that employers really need to keep on top of to make sure they manage the risk in their business. And, the last thing you want is a workforce impacted by COVID that's going to interrupt your operations, and then having unwell employees as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back to that policy side of things, demanding or instructing someone to have a COVID test, what are your thoughts on that?
So if you looked at it from a health and safety perspective, again, it goes back to the basis on which COVID is being managed within the workplace.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's about the context of the organisation, the way in which a worker may present risk to themselves or others, and that could be fellow staff or those they come in contact with, and the relevancy of ensuring that there's a recent test, and that result then is a valid thing that you can use as part of your control measures within the workplace. So I think that it always falls back down to the context of the organisation. What are you trying to control, and what is the reasonableness of the expectation on the staff member?
And then consulting. So if you want to introduce something, when a lot of businesses have the rapid antigen testing, for example, on site prior to being granted access, you'd need to introduce that and consult prior to then implementing it. There are lots of industries that are now requiring unvaccinated workers to have a PCR test, every 72 hours. So it's quite onerous if you're an unvaccinated person. To continue to work, you need to comply with those requirements, so long as you've followed that process to implement those, and it's meeting the reasonableness test if it's not mandated by law, are certainly measures that businesses can and have put in place to manage the risk.
Yeah, nice. Just a couple of things on recruitment that have popped up in the Q&A. Recruitment process, asking whether or not someone is vaccinated at an interview. How do we feel about that?
Justine, I'm going to pass that one to you.
Look, I mean, the guidance out there is, ask, what are you asking this information for? So if it's just a random question that has no relevance, then there'd be a question mark on it. It's going to come back down to that reasonableness. So if you must ask for it as part of a government mandate, then of course you've got to include that in your process and make sure you're collecting the correct information and that you're retaining it in the proper way. If you've got a reasonable and lawful mandate, and we know from that Fair Work Commission full bench decision that came out on Friday, they're certainly giving us the indicators that these types of mandates would be reasonable, but as Joe's already started off the webinar today on the detail you need to go in to actually get to that point. You need to properly understand the business. If you've got that mandate, that policy in place, then yes, it would be reasonable to then ask for the vaccination information and then declare to the employee what it is that you're doing with it, how you're going to retain it, looking at the privacy principles. Even if they don't apply to your business, it's still good practice to know and understand those. You are dealing with sensitive health information. I guess there is a risk of things like disability discrimination. If you're making a decision not to employ someone purely based on their vaccination status, and they may have a medical exemption or some other reason for not being vaccinated. So it's hard to give yes or no answers to some of these things or quick, short answers. It's going to depend on each case-by-case basis and what your business has in place, what you need that information for, what you're going to do with it, how you're going to store it and the like. So caution definitely does need to be taken if you don't have a policy in place to mandate as to whether you're asking for it. If you've got, a level of risk, so you've got vulnerable workers, you've got issues you need to manage in the business, and you may well have already made that decision to mandate the vaccine, so that would then just flow on from that.
Yeah, and I assume if you've got a mandatory vaccination policy that is sound, you could advertise in a job advert that you'd expect to be vaccinated if you came to work for that organisation.
Yeah, and you might then look at utilising, in a new employee or prospective employee's contract of employment, the requirement to be vaccinated as a condition of employment. No different to something like a visa for a worker that needs the right to have that for the right to work in Australia. So I think we'll probably see employers moving down those sorts of paths. But caution does need to be exercised. You just need to be reasonable and follow your processes in navigating all of these issues and making sure that you're not stepping outside of those boundaries in terms of what are you asking for the information for, and then what are you doing with it, what's the proposal for it. Most businesses, and Joe, I'm sure you'll have some comments on it, but most businesses will have some items of risk in their business in terms of COVID. So whether that's just employees catching public transport to work, or they're interacting with vulnerable workers as part of their duties, or it's a cafe interacting potentially with unvaccinated workers, even from the 17th of December, that are coming and collecting takeaway or the like. So it's getting a proper handle on what those risks are, and then all of these questions will should be fairly easily answered once you understand those risks in the business.
I think the other important thing to remember is that this is not the first time that vaccines may be mandated for a job requirement. So an important part of making any decision is obviously an environmental scan and research. So looking to industries where that may already pre-exist, seeing how those processes are already in place, because we can certainly look to those for insights and guidance on how a situation like that may therefore be played out within an organisation. The other thing I would do is that in any decision that's being made is project forward and think through the implications and then play it back, so that you can almost anticipate those scenarios before you actually put in place a policy or a procedure or a position on it.
And that's where that risk assessment process really helps, because it makes you think about all the different scenarios that could pop up.
Correct. And it's a bit like in health and safety, not to get too technical, but they talk about doing event trees. So you go, okay, we're going to do this. What's the events that might come out of it? And so it's actually looking and going, okay, well, these things may happen, which is why consulting with staff, a multidisciplinary approach. What's the mandates? What is the government saying? What do the regulators say? What's the Fair Work and others? What do all those mean in the context of the situation? And then going into it with your eyes really wide open.
Yeah, and just running that list down then, Jo, I can just see some of the business owners and some of our clients go, oh my God, so much.
Yeah.
It does seem like a lot, but we can actually tackle it in step by step. And I think the biggest thing here is it's an ever-changing environment. So we've got to be really careful that we don't jump the gun. We just don't panic about this sort of stuff. We just pace ourselves and deal with it as it pops up. I
agree. And I think it's probably never been a more important time to subscribe to law firms for news. The regulator and the Fair Work, with any organisation that is providing valid insights or information or guidance, now is a really great time. But also to be subscribed, attending webinars, but also using your business network. So what are other organisations doing? Any business manager or owner will have a network. So making sure you've got the right people in your network that you're talking to. Yeah, 100%. And also from a board perspective. So if you're the owner of the organisation, if you have a board, then consulting up as well as down within the organisation will be important, because it's a business position. Now we're at 12:50. I'm conscious that people have got to go. I have got one more question just in relation to visitors and customers. I'm just going to use Business Depot as an example, and I think we've probably answered a few of these questions. We've got an office environment with professional services. We have clients coming in all the time. We've got visitors. We have got the delivery driver, but we've also got people sitting in our meeting rooms, having meetings. How do we tackle if we don't have a mandate? Well, let's look at both scenarios. If we do have a mandate and we have visitors, and we don't have a mandate, this is probably a bigger question than 5 minutes, but what's some things to think about when we're looking at those people coming into our environment, our work environment? Because we have a workplace health and safety obligation here to the visitors as well, don't we, Jo? Absolutely. So if we think about the context of occupational health and in the circumstances of health and safety, it's about the impact of the worker on others and the workplace on themselves. So we absolutely have to look at it as a two-way street. So the mandate or the decision of the business will play out the approach that you take. So if you looked at it by way of mandating, then communicating to those through your website, through emails, through info that may be sent out will become really important, because what you don't want to necessarily have is people coming in not aware of it. So at least then you've got that preemptive approach. I think when people come into the business, you obviously have a mechanism for signing in, but it's a really great opportunity to check vaccination status at that point, if you choose to do so. And then it's about how your staff respond and manage to circumstances where there may be somebody that doesn't agree with your business decision. And certainly if we look at the behaviours of some people, public dealing with cafe owners or others, they are making their voices known. So I think it is worthwhile considering what are the implications for any decision that you make. Your risk assessment, your consultation is also important in terms of if you choose not to mandate. So if you haven't got the vaccinations being mandated in the workplace, well, what are your control measures? Because you've still got to protect those people that are coming in and your staff. So your attention to hygiene, the social distancing, if necessary, if somebody's concerned, the use of masks, it's okay to wear a mask. We might encourage it. Certainly not coming in if somebody's unwell or feeling sick. So all of those become part of your broader management of your visitors and guests to the business. Yeah, we can't go back to crowding meeting rooms, right? You can't have 70 around the Business Depot kitchen anymore. However nice the beers are, it's not possible. Yes, we're all suffering from that. Justine, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think you've really this is changing daily. So I think what you might do today, particularly in Queensland where our borders are about to open, we're slowly seeing the new strain creeping in to our community. It might be very different if community transition increases. So what you do today is not necessarily going to assist you to manage the risk on the other side of Christmas, for example, if we do have the borders coming with COVID, or the borders opening with COVID. So, you know, I think it's something you've got to keep looking at regularly in terms of understanding the issues and risks in the business. So it's not something you can confidently say, look, we've done our risk assessment, we've done our consultation, we've made our decision, for example, not to mandate, that you might need to change that to manage the risk in 1 or 2 months' time. Obviously, for the participants in New South Wales and Victoria, they've been in a very different environment to what we are here in Queensland, and they've been navigating those risks. So what they might then choose to do now, again, might be different to what a business in Queensland would do. So there's definitely no size fits all to this, even within your business itself and in the environment that you're operating with as well.
Yeah, no, well said. Look, it's time to wrap up. The three of us do agree there's probably another conversation via a webinar in the new year around this when we have more information, and so we'll tee that up. In the meantime, there is a recording of this that you can watch back. There will be an email that will come out to the registered participants with a list of links that you can go to, some of the things we talked about today. And just finally, I suppose, Justine and Joe, thank you. Again, we've only just kind of unravelled a little bit of this, but we hope that some of that information has been really useful to those that have tuned in. And yeah, take care and keep safe, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you.